Today's episode is on Richard Speck, the infamous and notorious serial killer from South Chicago who murdered nurses in 1966. Richard Speck believed that he'd been born to raise hell. Indeed, as a teenager, he had had those very words tattooed on his arm. It was neither a young man's folly nor an idle boast. Richard Franklin Speck was born 6 December 1941 in Kirkwood, Illinois, a small village of a few hundred people located midway between Chicago and Kansas City. The seventh of 8 children, he was very close to his father, Benjamin Speck. His young life was thrown into turmoil at the age of 6 when his father died. His mother relocated with some of the children, Richard included, to Fair Park, Texas, where she married a man named Carl Lindbergh. Speck watched as his mother, a religious woman with no tolerance for alcohol in the home, adapted to marriage with a drunken, violent man who had a history with the police. Speck came to hate his stepfather with the same passion he had shown in loving his father. In Texas, he was a poor student and demonstrated little interest in school. The 8th grade was the last he had managed to complete. Before his 12th birthday, he had begun to drink, as both an escape and a means of countering severe headaches brought on most likely by a series of head injuries. Entering adolescence, Speck was arrested for the first time. His offense, trespassing, would be joined by charges of burglary and stabbing as he progressed towards adulthood. In November 1962, he married a woman named Shirley Malone. The next year, the couple had a baby daughter, but his approach to the role of father was a stark contrast to that of Benjamin Speck. Convictions on theft, check fraud, and aggravated assault charges meant that he spent much of the marriage in prison. In January 1966, Speck's wife filed for divorce. She would claim that, on at least one occasion, he had raped her at knife point. Shortly thereafter, Speck was charged with stabbing and a burglary. Incredibly, he was let go after paying a fine of $10. With the support of his sister, he returned to the area of Illinois in which he had spent his early years. On 2 April, an elderly local woman, Mrs. Virgil Harris, was attacked, bound, and raped. 9 days later, a barmaid named Mary Kay Pierce was found dead behind Frank's Place, Speck's tavern of choice. He was questioned for the second crime, but became sick during the interrogation and was let go. Although he promised to return on 19 April, he never did. Local police tracked him to a hotel, but found he had run out just a few hours earlier. Left behind in Speck's room, they found a radio and jewelry belonging to Mrs. Harris. Speck seemed to have disappeared. In actual fact, he had found work on a ship on the Great Lakes. As he traveled, bodies seemed to appear in his wake. He was soon wanted for questioning about the disappearances of 3 females and the murders of 4 others. At approximately 11 o'clock on the evening of 14 July 1966, a student nurse named Cora Amaro answered a knocking at the door to a townhouse dormitory in South Chicago. She was met by Speck, who was holding a handgun. Grabbing her by the arm, he made his way through the townhouse, threatening the woman with his gun, until they'd all been gathered in one of the bedrooms. There were 6 of them altogether. Another student nurse, Gloria Davy, arrived home from a date and had the misfortune of stumbling into the scene. Speck would later claim that his original intention was simply to rob the woman. Indeed, each was made to give him money from their purses. However, he was soon ripping sheets from one of the bunk beds, using the strips to tie each woman's wrists and ankles. He had completed his task when another 2 students, Suzanne Ferris and Marianne Jordan, arrived home. When they came upon Speck and the bound women, they tried to flee the townhouse. Speck ran after the pair, and they were forced into one of the other bedrooms. He stabbed Jordan 3 times, including once in the eye. Ferris was strangled with a white nurse's stocking and stabbed 18 times in the chest and neck. They were the first of the 8 women who would die. Although he would later claim to have been high on alcohol and drugs, Speck spent the next several hours methodically removing the women from the room, each individually or in pairs. He would take each to another bedroom where they would be beaten, raped, and stabbed. Cora managed to escape this fate by hiding under one of the beds and pressed herself as tightly as possible against the wall. Speck simply lost track of the number of women he had bound. It later came out that he had known 8 women lived in the dormitory, but was unaware that there had been one visitor. That visitor happened to be Cora. After Speck left the dormitory, Cora remained hidden, not daring to come out from under the bed until 5 the next morning. She ran to the balcony and began screaming, "They're all dead! All my friends are dead! Oh my God, I'm the only one alive!" With the survivor on their hands, police moved quickly in identifying Speck. However, not all police officers had been alerted to the identity of the killer. 2 days after the murder, the police were called to a run-down hotel to investigate a complaint that a man named Staten had a gun in his room. Awakened by the cops, Staten gave his name as Richard Speck and explained the gun by saying that it belonged to a prostitute he picked up the night before. Satisfied, the police left. Drunk on beer and cheap wine, Speck kept moving through the low-rent areas of Chicago, always ahead of the police. However, by 19 July, his name and photograph were all over the front pages of the local papers. Speck bought these papers and a bottle of cheap wine, which he drank after returning to the cheap motel he'd rented. He then smashed the bottle and used the broken glass to slice open his wrists and inner elbow. He was discovered by the desk clerk and taken by ambulance to Cook County Hospital. It was Leroy Smith, the doctor who saved Speck's life, who identified the killer. He had read all about the wanted man and recognized the "Born to Raise Hell" tattoo from the newspaper description. While being treated, Speck told Smith that he had committed the murders of the 8 student nurses. However, it was a confession made under the influence of sedatives, and so could not be used in court. When he recovered from his suicide attempt, Speck maintained that he had no memory of the evening in the dormitory. Speck's trial began on 3 April 1967. The evidence presented appeared overwhelming. At the center of those testifying was the survivor, Cora. When asked whether she could identify the man who had murdered her friends, she rose from her seat, unlatched the witness box door, and walked across the courtroom and stood pointing before Speck, saying, "This is the man." 2 weeks later, when asked for their decision, it took the jury just 49 minutes to declare Speck guilty and to recommend the death penalty. Speck was sentenced to death on 5 June, a conviction that set in motion over 5 years of legal maneuverings. The ultimate decision, made on 21 November 1972, sentenced Speck to 8 consecutive terms of between 50 and 150 years. The following year, this was reduced to a new statutory maximum of 300 years. He was incarcerated at Statesville Correctional Center, a maximum security prison in Crest Hill, Illinois. Though he preferred solitary pastimes, such as stamp collecting, Speck was anything but a model prisoner. Most of his infractions involved drugs and bootleg alcohol. He sought and was denied parole on 6 different applications, the last being in 1990. Speck died of a heart attack on 5 December 1991, the day before what would have been his 50th birthday. An autopsy performed on his brain revealed gross abnormalities. However, further examination and study was curtailed after samples disappeared. Speck's unclaimed body was eventually cremated. A service was held, attended only by the county coroner, a deputy, a newspaper columnist, and a pastoral worker. His ashes were spread in an undisclosed location. The death of Richard Speck was a news story for a day or two. Some media outlets provided summaries of his awful crimes. Then just as Speck slowly began to fade from modern memory, in May 1996, a video surfaced. Believed to have been shot 2 years before his death, it features a bizarre-looking Speck with pendulous breasts, wearing blue silk panties. He is shown taking drugs and having sex. But more shocking than the visual images are Speck's words. Answers to questions posed by another inmate. He describes the process and strength required in strangling someone to death. When asked about the deaths of the 8 nurses, he responds, "It just wasn't their night." Controversy followed. Some advocates of the death penalty used the tapes to support their case. Others stated that it was obvious Speck was being forced by other inmates into the acts, and argued for panel reform.